Authors tend to have pack-rat minds as a matter of course, and I suspect that my mind packs more rats than most. Nation became a happy dumping ground for the hoarded junk of 50 years of joyfully undirected, serendipitous reading. Hendrik Willem von Loon's Story of the Pacific gave me a good background. Various accounts of the Krakatoa explosion and its aftermath were dredged up. A whole 3 shelves of accumulated world folklore got distilled into the affairs of one island. Scientist friends dug out esoteric information on how you can measure the age of glass. And this was a real coup. I found myself at a dinner sitting next to a man who not only knew that bullets could be slowed very, very rapidly by water, and also that in some circumstances they might even ricochet off the surface, but who was able to set up some tests in his big tanks just to check for certain. Blue Jupiter, viewing the giant planet in the daylight, is something I discovered for myself one evening in early autumn, when I spotted Sirius just visible in the sky and realized that the highly sophisticated GO2 function on my shiny new telescope would be able to use this data to locate Jupiter right at that moment. And 5 minutes later, there it was, blue and white like the daytime moon and with 3 of its own satellites visible. They kept the universe turned on even during the daytime. I had always known that to be true, but it was a moment of epiphany. By who, from what, and why, I don't know, but any epiphany is worth having. Even now, more than a year since the deed was done, I'm still not sure what Nation is, because it seemed to me that I channeled half of it. I have a reputation, or possibly a crime sheet, as a comic writer. And indeed, humor does break out sometimes in the book, and a smile will force its way through. Yet it begins with a boy burying the corpses of almost everyone he has ever known. I admired Mao's dilemma as he single-handedly invented humanism, railing at the gods for not existing, while at the same time needing them to exist to take the blame. I find it difficult to remember that I invented him. He seemed to create himself as the book progressed. At this point, people say in a kindly voice, the novel was clearly influenced by the fact that I was diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease during its completion. That would be interesting if it were true. It's even more interesting because it is not true. The first and quite complex draft had already been finished when I was diagnosed, and posterior cortical atrophy, which is the official term for my variant of the disease, is quite hard even for an expert to discover. From what I've been told, the disease may have been quietly and unobtrusively taking over the territory for very many years before I had an inkling that anything was wrong. All authors must occasionally wonder where the magic comes from, and sometimes I wonder where the strength of Daphne came from, and about the source of Mao's almost incoherent rage. Whatever their origins, I believe that Nation is the best book I have ever written or will write. Finally, or perhaps I should say climactically, I must thank my editors on both sides of the Atlantic, who got the best out of me with Nation by pushing needles under my fingernails, an ancient skill of the craft. I know it was for my own good, and I am grateful. Sincerely grateful, and this time I'm not kidding. I would be astonished and gratified to be standing in front of you today, if indeed I was in fact standing in front of you today, because it would mark something very special, a second chance that worked. Up until the mid-1990s, I was barely known in the US, while already selling in great numbers almost everywhere else in the world. The publishing situation was woeful. I remember that one edition, in paperback, went out across America with my name spelt wrong on every other page. And yet, when I went to US science fiction conventions, I would be faced by a huge queue of fans, all burdened down with gray import UK editions, hardcover ones at that. My agent did some calculations and presented the publisher with figures to show how much their sloth was costing them. Things began to move. Not long afterward, my publisher either took over somebody else or got taken over themselves. In practice, it's always a little difficult to be certain in these matters. Publishers tend to collide like galaxies, and you're never quite sure who ran into who, only that some stars have exploded and some constellations have gone freelance. But in short, I ended up with bright star editors who knew my work and cared about it, and even publicists who knew my name, which is always useful in a publicist. Strange things began to happen. I began to get royalties. I began to get big crowds at events. At one signing a few years ago, where the independent bookshop was stripped of all my titles within minutes of the beginning of an event, the crowd surged down to the nearest Barnes & Noble and did the same thing there. Who would have thought it? Am I proud? Well, I am English, and a knight, and, of course, properly modest and diffident. Hooray! Bingo! Ha ha! I have always treasured having one of my novels named an Amelia Bloomer book by the Feminist Task Force of the ALA, because there's something heartwarming about a man with a beard receiving accolades for strong feminist writing. But this is the Boston Globe Hornbook Award. I am truly honored to receive it, especially so as it is given by people who, if they are not librarians themselves, are often in league with librarians. Not long ago, I was invited to a librarian's event by a lady who cheerfully told me, "We like to think of ourselves as information providers." I was appalled by this want of ambition. I made my excuses and didn't go. After all, if you have a choice, why not call yourselves shining acolytes of the sacred flame of literacy in a dark and encroaching universe? I admit this is hard to put on a button, so why not abbreviate it to librarians? As I'm sure some of you know, I boasted the fact that for a couple of years I was a volunteer librarian, working weekends for no more reward than a cup of tea, a sweet biscuit, and a blind eye to the enormous number of books I was taking home. It seemed to me, even in those days, that librarian and their ilk were not mere providers. Information sleets down on us like confetti. We are knee-deep in this stuff. But I saw my fellow librarians as subtle guides and givers of context, a view that must have taken root when, one day, one of them pushed across the counter 3 books bound together with string. He said, "We think you might like this." It was The Lord of the Rings. Now that's what I call real librarianship. Postscript. Nation has done the rounds of Hollywood, but apparently is not of interest because it does not leave enough room for hilarious, wisecracking animals. We must be grateful for small mercies. Thank you.